Two of the most trusted weather models in the world looked at the exact same weekend and came back with opposite answers. One sees a dangerous tornado outbreak, the other sees nothing but suffocating heat. And meteorologists genuinely don't know which one is right. That is the actual state of the forecast right now across the middle of the United States, and it is one of the strangest setups meteorologists have talked about in years. So let's get into what is actually happening, because there is a lot going on, and almost none of it fits into one clean story. Right now, if you're standing in North Dakota or northern Minnesota, you probably needed a jacket this morning. Temperatures dropped into the upper 30s and low 40s in spots, which is genuinely unusual for the first week of August. A strong cold front pushed through overnight, and it dragged unseasonably cool air behind it. Highs across a big chunk of the Midwest will barely crawl into the 60s and 70s today, and in a few spots, especially where rain is falling, some places might not even leave the upper 50s. If you told someone in July that in a matter of days they'd need a hoodie in August, they'd have laughed at you. But that's exactly what's setting up right now, and it's only the first act of this story. Tomorrow morning is going to feel even more out of place for the calendar. Parts of Wisconsin and Nebraska could wake up in the upper 40s, maybe even nudging into the low 50s in a few sheltered spots. Picture that for a second. Early August, and people are scraping frost off their mental image of what this month is supposed to feel like, even if actual frost isn't in the cards. Meanwhile, farther east, the Ohio Valley hasn't even felt this front yet. That boundary is expected to stall out and crawl toward that region late Wednesday into early Thursday, which means places like Cincinnati or Louisville are still sitting in warm, humid air, while their neighbors to the north are already reaching for long sleeves. That kind of split cold on one side, warm and sticky on the other, is exactly the setup that tends to generate strong storms right along the dividing line. And that's precisely where we're headed next. Here's the thing, though. That cold front isn't just going to blow through and clear out like a normal system. It's stalling. It's grinding to a halt somewhere over the Central Plains, and a stalled front is a completely different animal than a fast-moving one. A fast front gives you one round of storms and then it's gone. A stalled front sits there for days, acting like a boundary where warm, humid air on one side keeps colliding with cooler air on the other. And that collision keeps regenerating storms in the same general corridor, day after day. That's the mechanism driving almost everything you're about to hear about, so keep that idea in your head, because it explains the flooding, the severe weather, and even part of the heat. Let's talk about the flooding first, because out of everything in this forecast, this is the threat that's actually the most certain. The Weather Prediction Center has already flagged a slight risk of excessive rainfall stretching from around Milwaukee and Chicago, west through Kansas City and Omaha. When a stalled front sits over the same area for multiple days, you don't need one massive storm to cause a problem. You just need average, ordinary thunderstorms to keep forming over the same towns over and over until the ground simply can't absorb any more water. Most places along this corridor are expected to pick up somewhere around half an inch to an inch of rain over the next several days. That alone isn't alarming, but buried inside that average are some much scarier numbers. Isolated locations, especially near St. Louis, near Columbia, and up around Milwaukee, could see 2 to 4 inches of rain. And in a few of the most unlucky spots, totals could approach 6 to 8 inches by the time this pattern finally breaks. That's the kind of number that turns a normal rainy week into a flash flood emergency. And this is exactly the kind of flooding that catches people off guard, because there's no single dramatic storm to point to. There's no one moment where everyone says, that's the big one. Instead, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Rain falls, soaks in, and seems manageable. Then more rain falls on top of already saturated ground. Then a little more. And at some point, one more ordinary. Thunderstorm rolls through, and suddenly a creek that's been fine for days jumps its banks in an hour. If you live anywhere near that Milwaukee to Chicago to Kansas City to Omaha corridor, this is the moment to actually think through your flood plan. Know your evacuation routes if you're in a flood-prone area. Know which roads near you tend to flood first. Don't wait until water is already moving to figure that out. This is also the type of flooding that trips people up in their cars. And it's worth saying plainly, most flood deaths in this country don't happen because someone was caught outside in a storm. They happen because someone drove onto a road that looked passable and had no idea how deep or how fast that water actually was. A road covered in even a foot of moving water can float a car and carry it off the pavement entirely. If you come up on a flooded roadway over the next several days, especially at night when it's hard to judge depth, the smart move is always to turn around and find another way. It sounds like an obvious rule, but it's one that gets ignored constantly, precisely because this kind of slow-building, unglamorous flooding doesn't feel as urgent as a single dramatic storm rolling through. Now let's talk about the storms themselves, because flooding isn't the only thing riding along this boundary. For Wednesday, the expectation is that rain and thunderstorms stretch from Iowa and Wisconsin into Illinois, Chicago, and down toward Indianapolis. A good chunk of that activity will likely stay below severe limits, meaning just heavy rain and some rumbles of thunder. But some of these storms, especially in the afternoon and evening hours, could turn into something more serious, with large hail and damaging wind gusts becoming the main concerns. There's a tornado risk in the mix as well, but it's being described as low, and it's highly dependent on how the earlier rounds of rain behave. Sometimes, when you get a lot of rain-cooled air sitting around from morning storms, it actually works against tornado development later in the day because it stabilizes the atmosphere. So this is one of those situations where meteorologists are watching hour by hour, not just day by day. By Thursday, that same disturbance is expected to weaken as it pushes into the Ohio Valley, which should limit the chances of a widespread severe weather outbreak there. But don't let that fool you into thinking the threat disappears completely. Farther west, in places like Nebraska and South Dakota, isolated severe thunderstorms could still fire up. And if they do, large hail and damaging straight-line winds would be the primary hazards to watch for. It's not expected to be a major outbreak, but it's certainly not nothing, and anyone in that region should keep half an eye on the sky Thursday afternoon and evening. And now we get to the part of the forecast that's genuinely, truly uncertain. The weekend. This is where things get strange, because this is where the two major forecast models, the European model and the American GFS model, completely part ways. The European model is telling one story. In this version, a line of thunderstorms develops over Iowa on Friday and pushes through Missouri and into Illinois. Under this scenario, once you get past Friday, the weekend actually calms down. Saturday and Sunday in the European model's world don't show much organized severe weather at all. It's almost like the atmosphere gets its energy out on Friday and then settles down for the weekend. The GFS model tells an almost completely opposite story. In this version, Friday is relatively quiet, without much severe weather to speak of. But then, over the weekend, a low-pressure system begins forming over South Dakota and northern Nebraska. And if that system develops the way the GFS thinks it will, it could support a much more significant and organized severe weather threat spreading into Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan by Saturday, with the potential for that activity to continue into Sunday. Under this version of the forecast, Monday and Tuesday of the following week could even bring additional storm systems if another area of low pressure develops over the Central Plains. So think about what that actually means. Two of the most sophisticated, most trusted weather models on the planet, both fed enormous amounts of data, both run by serious scientific organizations, are looking at the exact same patch of atmosphere over the exact same weekend and coming back with fundamentally different conclusions. One says relatively quiet. The other says a legitimate severe weather outbreak across the upper Midwest and Great Lakes. That's not a small disagreement. That's the difference between a boring weekend and a dangerous one for millions of people. Why does this happen? It comes down to something meteorologists talk about constantly in August specifically. This time of year is one of the hardest stretches to forecast with confidence, because a lot of the weather you get in August doesn't come from big, obvious, easy-to-track systems. It comes from small-scale features, little disturbances that ripple through the atmosphere and are incredibly sensitive to tiny changes. A slightly different track for a weak disturbance, a slightly different amount of morning cloud cover, a slightly different wind direction at a certain level of the atmosphere, and the entire outcome for a weekend can flip. When you don't have one dominant, well-defined storm system steering everything, forecasting becomes less like reading a map and more like trying to predict which way a leaf will drift in a gusty breeze. Small inputs, big differences in outcome. Compare that to something like a hurricane. A hurricane is a massive, well-organized system with a clear center, and even though the exact track can wobble, models generally agree on the big picture days in advance, because there's one dominant feature steering everything. This pattern has nothing like that. There's no single center of circulation anchoring the forecast. Instead, you've got a stalled front, a weak wave trying to organize over the plains, shifting moisture, and a heat dome all pushing and pulling against each other at the same time. Feed that kind of messy, multivariable setup into two different modeling systems, each with its own way of handling small-scale physics, and it's almost expected that they'll diverge. It's not that one model is broken and the other is right. It's that they're both making reasonable interpretations of an atmosphere that genuinely hasn't made up its mind yet. So if you're wondering which scenario is going to actually happen, the honest answer right now is nobody fully knows yet. It could easily be stormy, with real severe weather and possibly even tornadoes across the upper Midwest, or it could just end up being brutally hot and humid, with the atmosphere never quite pulling itself together enough to produce organized severe weather. Both outcomes are on the table, and the confidence level drops the further you look into the weekend. This is exactly the kind of forecast where you don't want to make hard plans off of one single model run days in advance. You want to keep watching as we get closer, because these details are going to sharpen up considerably over the next couple of days. Now, While all of that uncertainty is playing out with the storms, there is one part of this forecast that meteorologists are far more confident about, and that's the heat. While the northern plains and Midwest deal with that unusually cool air we talked about earlier, heat is building aggressively across the southern plains and the desert southwest. Dallas and Oklahoma City are expected to approach the 105 to 110 degree range, and that kind of heat isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous, especially for anyone without reliable air conditioning or anyone who has to work outdoors. By Thursday and Friday, the heat starts pushing farther north into the Great Plains, including South Dakota and Iowa, with temperatures expected to climb into the mid and upper 90s, and in some spots, possibly crossing the 100-degree mark. That's already impressive for early August, but it's what happens over the weekend that has meteorologists genuinely stunned. One run of the GFS model is showing actual air temperatures, not heat index, not feels-like readings, but actual measured air temperature, reaching as high as 115 degrees in parts of Nebraska and western Iowa. Let that number sit for a second. 115 degrees in Nebraska in August as an actual temperature reading. That is an extraordinary number for that part of the country at any time of year, and it's been described by meteorologists tracking this pattern as flat out insane for this time of the year. Now, to be fair, this is a single model run several days out, and extreme outputs like that should never be treated as a locked-in guarantee. Models can and do overshoot, especially with heat extremes projected multiple days in advance. But even accounting for some likely correction, the fact that a major forecast model is even generating a number like that tells you how powerful this developing heat dome has the potential to become if clouds and thunderstorms don't manage to interrupt it. There's a reason this matters beyond just an eye-catching number. If that heat dome fully builds in the way some of the guidance suggests, it could actually work against the severe weather potential for parts of the region. A strong, well-established heat dome tends to suppress thunderstorm development underneath it because the sinking air associated with high pressure caps off the atmosphere and prevents storms from breaking through. So in a strange way, the heat scenario and the severe weather scenario are somewhat in competition with each other. If the heat dome wins out and expands as strongly as some models suggest, it could actually reduce the chances of the more dramatic severe weather outbreak that the GFS model is hinting at for the weekend. If the atmosphere instead favors storm development, that could help keep the most extreme heat numbers from fully materializing. It's part of why this forecast is so genuinely tangled. The two biggest threats in play aren't just happening side by side. They're partly working against each other, which makes untangling exactly what's going to happen even harder. Either way, expect the heat to ease back just slightly by Sunday and Monday, but don't expect a dramatic cool down. Much of the plains is likely to stay unusually hot heading into the start of next week. There is chatter in some of the longer range guidance about a stronger storm system potentially arriving by the middle of next week that could finally bring more meaningful cooler air back into the Midwest, but that's still far enough out that it should be treated as a possibility to watch, rather than something to count on. Now, on top of the flooding, the severe weather uncertainty, and the developing heat dome, there's a fourth ingredient in this pattern that often gets overlooked, and that's wildfire smoke. Out in the Pacific Northwest, in states like Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, wildfire conditions have actually started to become slightly less favorable for new fires to spark, which is genuinely good news after a stretch of very active and very dangerous fire behavior in that region. But the smoke that's already been generated from ongoing fires isn't just going to disappear. It's continuing to spread eastward, drifting into the Central Plains and into the Midwest. For most communities east of the Rockies, the bulk of that smoke is expected to stay elevated, up in the atmosphere, rather than settling down to ground level, which means you're mainly looking at hazy skies rather than genuinely hazardous air quality. But it's not going to be uniform everywhere. Parts of South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa could see some of that smoke work its way down closer to the surface. And if you live in one of those areas and you have asthma, another respiratory condition, or you're just sensitive to poor air quality, it's worth paying attention to local air quality reports and limiting extended time outdoors if things start to look hazy or your air quality index climbs. The worst of the smoke, by far, remains concentrated closer to the fire zones themselves out in the Northwest, where ground-level air quality has been a serious ongoing concern. So when you step back and look at the entire picture together, what you're really looking at is not one weather event. It's 4 different weather stories, all overlapping, all interacting with each other, across the same general region of the country, in the same general window of time. You've got a stalled frontal boundary generating a real and fairly confident flash flood threat from the Central Plains into the Great Lakes. You've got a severe weather threat that's fairly manageable through midweek, but becomes wildly uncertain by the weekend, with 2 major models offering essentially opposite outcomes. You've got a heat dome that could push actual air temperatures into the 100 teens across parts of Nebraska and Iowa, an extraordinary number for early August. And you've got wildfire smoke drifting in from the northwest, adding a layer of air quality concern on top of everything else.